Welcome to a very special episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, recorded during our mental fitness event as a part of our virtual LeaderCon series. In this conversation, we talked about reducing isolation and creating greater connection with our folks, regardless of where each of us might be working. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Are you ready? Let's go. Welcome back, everybody. Glad to have you joining us in this new session. We've got these two great guys with us. I've just met them, but I've already read their books, so I feel like I know them. And I'm going to just dive in and introduce them. So first of all, at least as I look at the screen, Ryan is on the right. Ryan, raise your hand. So that's how I'm going to remember it, right? And so that may not be on your right, but Ryan just waved. And now Steve is going to raise his hand, so you know who Steve is. Okay, with that, let me tell you who they actually are. Ryan Jenkins and Steve Van Cohen are the founders of LessLonely.com. How about that, everybody? LessLonely.com, the world's #1 resource for addressing workplace loneliness and creating more belonging at work. All those in favor say aye. They are also the authors of, and that's how I'm connected to them, of this book, this great book, Connectable: How Leaders Can Move Teams from Isolated to All In. Collectively, they have over 20 years of experience in helping organizations like Coca-Cola, the Home Depot, State Farm, John Deere, one of my all-time favorite companies, Delta Airlines, Salesforce, to improve their teams. Their work has been featured in Fast Company, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and many more. When they're not writing or speaking, you can find them sampling craft beers, hopefully not at 11:15 a.m. on a Wednesday, attempting to play golf together, and spending quality time with their families. Welcome, guys. Glad you're here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, pleasure.
So we're going to dive in, but before we go too far, let's just start with this. How did you guys get connected, and how did you end up thinking about and talking about and studying loneliness?
Go ahead,
Ryan,
Steve.
do you want me to? Yeah, so I was feeling extremely lonely like 6 years ago, and I was seeking a friend, and I came across this brilliant individual over here to my right. Well, no, what happened is I had an idea for a business back in 2015 to create some really specialized learning and development initiatives for emerging professionals, so millennials and Gen Z. And every article I found about millennials in the workplace was written by this guy over here. And I randomly reached out and I said, hey, I have this crazy business idea, wondering if you might want to learn about it. He didn't respond. Sent him another message, didn't respond. Sent him a third message. Third time is a charm. He read this message while his wife's in labor in the hospital. And his wife said, you should message this guy back. He obviously has something to talk about 6 years ago. So Ryan and I have been collaborating ever since. And I'll let Ryan explain how we got onto this topic of loneliness in the workplace.
Yeah, so we had been studying Generation Z because that was kind of our space. We were helping organizations unpack the emerging generation so they can better lead, attract, and engage the emerging workforce. And it was in our studies of Gen Z that we found that they're the loneliest and most isolated generation. And it was for the first time ever that the emerging generation was experiencing more loneliness than the elderly population in culture. So it was the first time it was really lopsided. So we thought this is very troubling. This was all pre-COVID. And so we began studying loneliness. And then when the pandemic happened, we brought all this loneliness research to our clients thinking, I don't know, do people want to talk about loneliness? We didn't think they did or would want to. And we were dead wrong. The appetite for this topic was more than we thought was going to be. And that catapulted our research. We surveyed over 2,000 global workers, and we really dug in our heels here and created all kinds of resources to help today's corporations and teams create stronger teams and to ultimately perform better at work. So that's the snapshot of the journey thus far.
So if I've got the guys that built the website called LessLonely.com, then I think it's appropriate that one of you tell us, hey, Steven's got his name up there. How fancy. That one of you give us the definition. Okay, give us a definition of loneliness.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, so loneliness is the absence of connection. It's not the absence of people. because we've all experienced this. Everyone watching this, you've experienced disconnection or isolation amid a crowded room. So it's not the absence of people, it's the absence of connection. And we take that even further as far as really monitoring the connection that you have with yourself, with those around you, with the organization you're involved with the work that you're involved with. So there's all these connection points that we need to be thinking about if we want to really draw ourselves into the work that we're doing, if we want to strengthen our team. And so that's what's really important. That's what really gets people kind of that aha moment for folks is, oh yeah, loneliness isn't about the absence of people, the absence of connection.
It's also about the perceived inadequacy of the connections you want and the connections you have. So loneliness is experienced differently by everyone, right? Because I might only need a small handful of really close friends to feel fully connected, or I might need an army, an entire community of people in order to feel like I'm woven back into the fabric of society. So when we have our perceived gap,
friends on Facebook, baby.
There you go. That maybe for you is the quota. For me, maybe it's 30, but it's that gap of what I want with my connections and what I have is what creates that feeling of loneliness and isolation.
There's a song that is not one that, I mean, it's sort of a, back catalog song that talks about the difference between being alone and being lonely. Right. And I think it's one of the things I love about your definition, because if you think about what we've all been living through for 2 years, or, working at a distance from each other as we, long distance leadership, long distance teammate, the names of our last 2 books, this idea of being at a distance doesn't necessarily mean loneliness. Although we had a loneliness epidemic in this country before we had a pandemic, right? And certainly working separately didn't make it better. And, guys, when I've talked with folks from around the world on webinars and asked this question, like, what's the biggest, I did it yesterday. What's the biggest challenge you're facing in your work right now? Number one answer, lack of connection, right? Yeah. So I love that you're tying those 2 things back together. So, but before we go further with that definition of loneliness, talk about the difference between loneliness and solitude, because I actually am a big believer in solitude, the difference between being alone and being lonely. So talk about that a little bit. Stephen, I'm going to let you do it.
Well, isolation in itself is not positive or negative. It's neutral. The negative form of isolation is loneliness. The restorative form of isolation is solitude. And when Ryan talked about how connection has lots of flavors, connection to self, connection to team, connection to leader, community, purpose, we have a whole color, trove of different options when it comes to connection. Connection to self is really important. And when you have time to remove yourself from all of the different activities of others, so you can focus inward and you can take time to think and process and digest, that's a really, really important connective experience for yourself. So solitude is really important, and it's something that we have to fight for because we're living in a always on, very busy society that doesn't give us as much time as we need for it.
I love that word restorative, because I immediately was transformed to being with some of my closest friends this past weekend, and that was restorative. Mm-hmm. But so is it for me when I know that I think I'm going to be going to our farm in Michigan by myself. I will see family, but I will stay at the farm by myself, and that will be equally restorative to me. I love that. I love that. There's a question that came in from Olivier. So this is a question coming all the way from Belgium, by the way, guys. Is it possible to be fully connected online and feel lonely because we don't meet people physically?
Yes. Yeah, that's kind of the troubling reality that we now live in, is that we're more connected than ever before, yet we're experiencing disconnection at a level we've never experienced before. And we cover it in the book. It's this kind of phenomenon called social snacking, where it's kind of we're snacking just enough through our online connections, social media, and to where we're keeping our loneliness levels just below the surface, where it's not, debilitating us, and it's not a chronic loneliness that we're experiencing. And so if you think of it that way, that, what happens when you snack? Well, you just get enough to where but you're not fully nourished. And so that's why it's important that we engage in in-person and other rich conversations outside of the kind of the passive connections that we experience on social, because we're not getting that nourishment that we need, that our body is hardwired to take in. So that's something that we're all really struggling with, is that we just are social snacking, and we need to get our hand out of that snacking jar, and we need to start finding those nourishing conversations so that we can really stay mentally fit, right? That's the conversation of the day. And that we can really continue to have a boosted well-being so that we can have healthy mental health, physical health, and obviously be performing in our organizations.
And I'll add one more thing to that, Kevin, if that's okay. When Ryan says a nourishing connection, there are a lot of connection points that we have that are transactional. So most of our day, we're communicating all day, every day, and we're having lots of touch points with other people. But most of those touch points are transactional. And those transactional communication touch points are registered in a part of the brain that is processing communication. The part of the brain that registers connection is totally different. So while we're communicating all day, it doesn't mean that our brain is processing the connection points. A connection experience, a nourishing engagement, is when someone really sees me. They really care about how I'm doing. They are providing me empathy. They're asking me genuine questions. They're really curious. They're actively listening. So when I am experiencing that from somebody else, it is that word restorative that you liked, right? It's a nourishing experience. But that is happening less and less as we're busier and busier than ever before. So while you're doing that virtually or in person, it can happen in both environments. But when you're together, it's not as transactional, because we're actually in the same space at the same time, and there's just a totally different set of expectations when that happens.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to consider. We talk about that, the difference between interaction and transaction, right? So much is transactional, the work and the weather, right, as opposed to interactional. And so many people are, and I'm gonna make a statement, let you guys respond to it. So much of what's going on right now with all of the discussion about where are people going to work, are we bringing people back, are we not bringing people back, how many days a week are we bringing people back, and all of that hubbub, right, is about, like, we can't get connection unless we're physically together. And I would say, no, we may have to come at it differently. It might be easier to get connection when we're physically together, but I don't at all believe it's required in order for us to have successful work happen. Thoughts about that? Either what, you're nodding, so I guess we're somewhat in agreement. Go ahead.
Yeah, you can build, you're right, Kevin, you can build connections whether you're virtual or in person. We have to work a little bit harder when it's virtual, right? We got to
and differently, right? And differently.
Yeah. But I'd like to, kind of push back on because we're talking to a lot of clients that are having this conversation. Do we go fully back, or do we hybrid, and what do we do? And they're having a hard time. One group wants to do this, another group wants to do this. But I think what we're missing in this conversation is the piece around connection. And we're wildly underestimating how much we need connection. And because I think we understand that relationships are important, but I don't think we know how physically vital it is that we create connections and we cultivate those consistently. And so I think what's happening here is, I think people are choosing convenience over connection. And we've been doing this for a long time. And Steve and I used the analogy of an ATM in the book. So before the ATM, when you had to go cash your check, you'd stroll into the bank and you'd have a conversation with the bank teller or other customers or other bank employees. In fact, we were telling this story at a live event. We do a lot of speaking engagements as it relates to the book. And I was sharing the story, and a gal came up afterwards. She said, I used to be a bank teller, and I was working at a bank before the ATM. And every Friday it was a party, and everyone knew and was connecting, and everyone was having a great time. The ATM came in, and then everybody vanished, and we lost track of folks, and that the social fabric started to fray, and we all just drifted apart. And we're doing this all the time now. Their ATMs come in multiple formats in our lives now, right? So where we're choosing convenience, and then connection is left in the wind. And so I think that's what's happening here too, is that remote work, hybrid work, right, is convenient. And so we're choosing that. And without a doubt, it's going to stick around. And without a doubt, we can be productive. But we have to be thinking about that connection piece, because if we're not intentional, if we don't fight for it, it's just going to drift away. It's going to disappear like those people in the bank before the ATM. So I think that's the piece, is we got to be thinking about, are we moving towards convenience? And if so, how can we use these convenience and the new margin that we have choosing these convenience options to create more connection?
And it's over here in the chat, which you guys can probably see, as I know you can see as well, this whole idea that you said being purposeful. Over in the chat, they're saying people in the chat, they're saying being purposeful. You're saying being intentional. Same thing, right? And so here's my ATM story. I remember the first time I ever saw one. I was with my dad. It was being put in. It was being put into our hometown bank before you could walk in the door, right? To be right there on the right-hand side. And one of the VPs of the bank was a good friend of ours and high school classmate of my dad's. And John L. said, Phil, let me show you the ATM. And he's showing him, and my dad is, being semi-patient about it. But when John L. finished, my dad said, but why would I want to do that? I want to talk to people. I mean, it's exactly the opposite of that, right? And I love this idea of convenience or connection. And there's more stuff going on in the comments about that. I really, really love that. So
Kevin,
I want to get to your less. Oh, please go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but yeah,
No,
the inventor of the ATM, Donald Wetzel, his wife has never used the ATM for the same reason of the story that you just said there. Imagine creating this groundbreaking ATM or invention, bringing it to your wife or significant other and being like, look at this thing, come try it out. I've spent, enormous amounts of time on this. I'm so excited about it. And she was just like, nope. And he was like, why won't you use the ATM? And she said, because it'll never smile back at me. And so that's a masterclass on how she's found one way to choose connection over convenience. And that's something we all need to take to heart and find ways to do nowadays.
And I'll say this, Kevin, too, because I think this is an important part of the conversation, especially at work. I've been a leadership consultant for 14 years. I've done a lot of executive coaching. I've done a lot of workshops. I have a master's degree in organizational development that's focused on leadership. So I have a lot of experience understanding what it takes to build really successful cultures and really successful team dynamics. And whenever we start to talk about topics like this one, it's almost like, we don't have time for that. This is not that important. There's other fires that need to be put out. This is not a priority. But what's really interesting is when you look at the data, this is not a soft topic. This is a dire topic. Because when people are showing up lonely to work, they're 7 times more likely to be disengaged. They're 5 times more likely to miss work due to stress or illness. They're twice as likely to think about quitting their job, and they're more likely to be remote workers. So when we think about just that, and there's a whole treasure trove of lots of other data points that support this, this is not something we should just do because it feels good. This has real implications to our productivity, to our engagement, to our retention, to our strategy, to all of our performance. So this is a really important thing that we have to unpack and understand.
I actually think that this is one of, and I think there are many, silver linings of the cloud of the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
That many leaders sort of knew that to survive, they needed to be more empathetic. They worked their empathy muscle a bit, at least early in the pandemic. And the wisest of those leaders are continuing. And so, there's been a whole bunch of things that have happened. If you watch the NCAA basketball tournament, there's all these Powerade commercials about the power of the pause. And we've got people that have said, I'm not going to compete in an Olympics because I'm not feeling mentally ready to do that. And all that stuff has raised the awareness of all of this stuff, Stephen, to your point. And I think that leaders who are wise are realizing that this is real. Yeah. You want to add to that comment? Either one of you?
Yeah. I'll also add the biology of how our brain is responding to feelings of isolation is really interesting. So they did this experiment and they put people through an experience of exclusion, and they had an fMRI map on their brain. So they're registering the activity. And when the people felt excluded, the part of the brain that lit up is the same part of the brain that registers physical pain. So I'm going to say that one more time. The part of the brain that lights up when you feel excluded, disconnected, isolated, alone, is the same part that registers physical pain. It's a fight or flight response, which means if I'm feeling lonely at work, my brain is flashing a high threat like you're in a dangerous situation. You need to fix this. And I cannot be fully present and I cannot do deep, meaningful work if I have a high threat alarm going off inside my brain. So the wisest leaders who start to understand that empathy is a really important and powerful tool, those, you call them the wisest, and they are the wisest, but I'm hoping that we can get more people to that classification.
100%, right?
Yeah.
We all 100%. And I guess why I call it a silver lining is I think that more are realizing it than ever. And
Yeah,
I think we have a long way to go there.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's maybe some small part of why today exists, why we created this day, is that we felt like that we knew that as leaders, we needed to be, I said it in our open, self-care isn't selfish. We need to work on ourselves, but also recognizing that this is a real thing that we need to work on with our organizations. One of the reasons I wanted you guys here specifically to talk about this, one of the things in the book, and we are talking with Steve Van Cohen and Ryan Jenkins about their great book, Connectable. Here it is, Connectable. It is sort of the second half of the book. Well, before we do that, I want to get to the less loneliness framework. But before we do that, there's a word that's prevalent in the book and in your work that we haven't used yet. It's the word that starts with B. So, how did we get 20 minutes in and not talk about the B word? And no, it's not that B word, Angie. Ryan, what's the B word?
B word is belonging. So we introduced that as the antidote to loneliness, and how we define belongingness is really defined by the human emotion to be accepted by a member of the group. And so it varies from diversity, equity, and inclusion, because diversity is having everyone invited to the meeting. Then we see equity as having everyone contribute to the meeting agenda. Inclusion is having everyone have a voice in that meeting, but belonging is having everyone's voice heard. And so, yeah, we go deep on belonging. And I think why it's so important, this usually resonates with folks. Think of it, think of our ancestors who roamed the plains all those years ago. When someone was excluded from a group, your survival rate plummeted. And so that's why the alarm bells still go off in our brain, as Stephen was mentioning that research. But that's why belonging is so important to us, because we can pool our resources and we could watch each other's back. And that's what's made humanity the greatest species of all time, is that we can collaborate and we're social and we crave that sense of belonging. And so when we experience loneliness, when we don't address loneliness, that flies directly right in the face of what makes our species the best that's ever lived on this planet.
Yeah, I love that. So a question has come in, and I'm going to ask his question, and then I'm going to add a question to it. So the preface is this. Eric says, what I've noticed more with virtual connections, and both with colleagues and clients, that better connections are made when people allow themselves to be open and more vulnerable and expressive. I see you guys nodding to that. I've noticed much more two-way empathy. So his question is, does the book touch on those topics? But I'll add, what would you say about his observation?
Yeah, the observation's sound. There is a section in the book where we talk about that, but there's a distinction that Ryan and I prefer when it comes to this idea of vulnerability. So Brene Brown is the guru of belonging and vulnerability and trust. And she has done a very nice job explaining why being vulnerable is so important. However, being vulnerable is very hard, especially when you work in an environment that doesn't organically allow for that to take place. So one of the things that we recommend is, instead of being vulnerable, it's important for us to be relatable. Relatability still allows us to share what's going on and to talk about the things in our life and to express what's happening around us, but it doesn't force us to feel like this vulnerability of, I have to open the closet and kind of let loose all of the skeletons that exist in my life. And when we can toggle between vulnerability and relatability, that's when connections can take place. And the way that we've defined loneliness in a loose way is, loneliness is essentially being seen through. Belonging is being seen as. It's when someone really sees you, like they understand where you're at and who you are and what you're going through. And relatability is a really important way to allow for that, ability to be fully seen to take place.
Yeah, I love that. There's a couple of more questions that have come in. I want to give everybody a little bit of a tip here. If you go in and look at those questions, you can actually vote. Hey, I like that question more or less. And the reason I'm saying that now is, I don't know if we'll get to them all. A couple of them we've already answered, because I need us to get to the less loneliness framework. And so I'm going to go there next. And then if you guys want to look at those questions, we'll try to get to all of them. But if you want to vote for the ones you like better, feel free to do that. So tell us about the less loneliness framework. I'm going to hold it up here in the book so people can get some clue as you guys talk about it. Maybe they'll be able to at least they won't see the words, but they can see the pieces. This is probably a better picture than looking at Kevin's face, just so. But that's the way it looks. But walk us through the 4 pieces of the framework.
Yeah, I'll have Steve go through the actual 4 steps. I'll take one step back, and we teed this up. We also created what's called the 3 L's of life. So it's kind of we respectfully challenged Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I know that's a big undertaking. We respectfully challenged and pushed against Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'm sure viewers, you can remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs that had 6 needs, starting with our physiological needs and then ending at the top of the pyramid with self-actualization. And we wanted to push back on that because right in the middle of that pyramid of our needs was belonging. And we looked at the longest study of adult development ever conducted that's still going on today. It's the Harvard University's study of adult development. It's gone on for over 80 years. They've studied over 2,000 people. And the definitive answer to a long and healthy life, according to that study, was quality relationships. So while our physiological needs might not be the most urgent need, right? Well, our physiological needs are our most urgent needs, right? We got to eat, we got to hydrate, we got to stay protected. But our most dire need is a sense of belonging, right? To creating relationships, our social connections. And so we wanted to create a model, and that's where we came up with the 3 L's. It looks like a Wi-Fi icon to remind us that we're connecting our devices all day, but we also got to make sure that we're connecting ourselves to humanity because it's that vital. And so the 3 L's are live, which are our physiological needs. The second bar in that Wi-Fi icon is to learn, like we're constantly learning and growing. When we were infants, we were learning the language of our tribe so that we could communicate our needs, right? So that's important. But the largest bar in that needs model is to link. So it's live, learn, link. And link, of course, is belonging. And so that link, L-I-N-K, is actually then extrapolated out. And that's what created the 4-step less loneliness framework that Steve can take us through.
Yeah, so the first part of the model of a link, it's an acronym. L stands for look at loneliness. So looking at loneliness means you're looking at it, like you're understanding it, so you can make sense of why it's important. You're looking at it inward, so you can understand how lonely are you and how have you felt it and dealt with it. And then you're looking at it from an outward standpoint where you're paying attention to the people around you. And the first part of the process is awareness, right? We have to understand, is this impacting us, others, and what are the signs? And in that chapter, we go through 10 signs that give you some good indicators that someone is lonely. If you go to lesslonely.com, there's a free assessment at the very bottom of the website where you can get a quick snapshot of how lonely you are feeling, and it's a pretty good tool. So that's the first part. The second part is to invest in connections. And we use the word invest very intentionally because connections don't just build themselves. They take work and they take commitment, and it's something that needs to be prioritized. And there's a whole set of strategies that we talk about as it pertains to investing in connection. And then N stands for narrow the focus. So because we have lots of different connection points, especially at work, narrowing the focus is how we're giving our attention to the things that help us feel less lonely. So at work, having a sense of purpose is something that gives us the feeling of belonging. So we talk about how to narrow on your purpose. We talk about clarity being really important because it's lonely when you're lost. So getting clarity at work helps you feel less lonely. So there's all these really tactical things you can do to narrow the focus. And then the K is to kindle the momentum, meaning that after you've looked and you've invested in the connections and you've narrowed the focus and things are churning along, you have to continue to sort of stoke the flame that you've started to create a little bit of a burn, because you don't connect once and feel fully connected forever. It's just like a phone, right? Like you got to keep plugging it in, you got to keep charging it, and kindling the momentum is continuously doing certain things to keep the momentum up. So that's the model in a very quick and high level synopsis.
And I knew that's all we could do is quick and high level, because people need to get a copy of this book, Connectable, Ryan Jenkins and Steve Van Cohen. So 10 people have voted for Stacy's question. So I feel compelled to ask this question. And here it is. So what are some practical, concrete ways to successfully address loneliness in workplaces where this is an issue? I mean, I think we've talked about some of those things already, but like, we're getting near our end here. So lay out some very concrete, specific things that we can do.
Yeah, first and foremost, I want folks to know that loneliness has been growing for years now. Of course, during the pandemic, it accelerated. But guess what? Because it's increasing, that means it's malleable, and that means it can decrease. And the first step, in the last loneliness framework that Steve highlighted, is awareness. So having this awareness so that this is an issue and how important connection is truly the first step. So having conversations like this and starting to broach these topics with your peers and your colleagues is really important. And what we found, what was really surprising to us and why people are loving the book, is how subtle the pro-social behaviors that you can do are to actually decrease loneliness. So research tells us it only takes one work friend to start to decrease loneliness. In an interaction between two people, it takes as little as 40 seconds to decrease loneliness and cultivate a connection. And then here's a good example. We highlighted we interviewed over 50 global leaders on what they're doing to lessen loneliness. So the book is jam-packed with examples. So one example of an organization, they do what's called the inside scoop. So they spend just 5 minutes every week on their all hands meeting, whether that's in person or virtual. And all the strategies we share in the book are hybrid. So they can be even conducted virtually or in person. Yep. And they spend 5 minutes at the top of a meeting, and they go around where there's one person every meeting that for 5 minutes, they share something that's non-work related. And they bring a picture and they show something that they're working on, someone that they love, someone that they're excited about. And this one example that they shared was there was this one individual, the whole team saw this person as a very hardworking researcher. And then she showed a picture of her marathon training. And no one had any idea that she was this outstanding athlete. And she actually had qualified for the Olympics, and none of her teammates knew this. And so all of a sudden, by just sharing that one picture and spending 5 minutes sharing a little bit about something about personal that she's up to or she's enjoying, now people could see the human behind the job. So they didn't just see her now as this detailed oriented researcher. They saw her as this extraordinary athlete. And now there's more points that the team can connect with her and they can strengthen the connection. So that's one simple way what we can do to start drawing in each other and creating more connection. And that was the inside scoop that one organization shared with us. Steve, you have another tip you can share real quick?
Before you do that, Steve, Tia says it's like show and tell as a kid, and to which I would simply say we are just kids in adult bodies. So there's more, and we should probably all play in a sandbox once in a while too. It wouldn't hurt us either.
I love that. Yeah.
Some of the people on my team would say, well, Kevin, you're just going to get on a tractor and play in a field. It's just a bigger sandbox. Steve, what do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, there's 40 strategies that we can talk about. The two that resonate the most with the clients I work with, because they're not necessarily what we naturally think we should do. We just think, oh, like I'm lonely, I just need to go talk to someone, and boom, I'm going to feel less lonely. But there's some other things that can be done that are really helpful. And I mentioned them briefly when I talked about the narrowing section of the model. But the first is to identify the beneficiaries of the labor. So when we had a conversation with a really brilliant researcher out of UCLA, his name's Dr. Stephen Cole, and he's one of the leading researchers of loneliness on the molecular levels, like really what's loneliness doing from a physiological standpoint. And he said, through all of the research and all of the work and all the things he's done, he said the fastest way to pull somebody from feeling lonely to feeling connected is to make them feel invaluable. So when someone is feeling significant and needed and desired, that is the quickest way for them to all of a sudden want to connect, because all of a sudden I'm needed, right? Like people want me around. And when you can reach out to someone and say, hey, I need you because of X, Y, and Z, or when an individual can say, hey, I'm important because of this work that I do and this impact that it has, all of that kind of activity is really, really powerful in lessening loneliness.
The longer we work separately, the longer we work in our house or wherever we're working virtual at a distance from others, the more we become insular. But the moment that I know that I'm not just doing this and handing it off, but I'm doing this and it makes Marissa's job easier, or it makes not just a customer, make it for the customer, but I'm making it for Jonathan. Like that changes everything, not just about loneliness, although it certainly does all of what you just said, Steve, but it changes everything. And it has a huge impact on our retention and the quality of the work that's delivered and all that. The more we have a personal connection to who's going to use this, the more powerful it becomes for all of us, for sure. Man, totally. There's a kind of, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna agree. When we talk about loneliness in the workplace, you could sometimes see like the alarm signals flashing in people's eyeballs, because they're like, you want to have me as a leader address loneliness with my team? Like, I don't think so. And we don't expect anybody who's in a leadership role or anybody who cares about their team members to be a therapist or to be a mental health practitioner. Like, we don't want you to necessarily diagnose and have to, be therapeutic in what you do. However, when it comes to doing this work, when you understand some of these, tactical strategies, you don't ever have to call out loneliness, but you can address it and impact it and lessen it in really strategic ways. And that's one of the amazing things that we uncovered when we started to write the book, that you're fighting this and nobody will know, because you don't ever have to call it out if you know what to do.
And if you just focus on how do I create more connection and more belonging, I would say if everyone would just remember, if you ask those two questions, you're going to be in really good stead. Now, this whole event, is framed around the idea of fostering mental fitness. And so everything we've talked about, clearly there's a connection to individuals and our individual and collective mental fitness. But I'm going to ask both of you this question. And you can decide who goes first as we start to wrap up. The question is, what do you do to improve your mental fitness?
Yeah, I'll go first. This has been a fun journey that Steve and I've been on, and I'm an introvert. Steve's an extrovert. So it's been fun to apply both of these different personality traits to the topic of connection. And research after research shows it doesn't matter, introverted or extroverted, we all pine for people. And they say that authors write the books that they were supposed to read themselves. And I think that was true for me as an introvert. And I think the thing that stood out to me the most that's helping me with my mental health is this, that connections don't have to be lasting to be meaningful. As an introvert, I tend to want to go deep in relationships, and I want to go far with relationships. So if I'd share an elevator with somebody, I wouldn't engage, because I knew that was a connection that wouldn't be lasting. And the research, and after spending 2 years immersed in this content, I know that is just false. And I am a source of well-being for that other individual in the elevator. That person is a source of well-being for me as well. We're all sources of well-being for each other. And so we have to start picking our heads up and connecting. And so the one thing I do now is I'll always ask folks, how's your day going? And just be present in that moment, kind of absorb what and we have a short exchange in that elevator as an example. I leave with my well-being boosted, and I know that they do the same. And so I look for all those opportunities that I've been missing and ignoring all these years. And that's something I'm hyper focused on and excited about continuing to doing for the rest of my life, because I know how important those connections are. And again, they don't have to be lasting to be meaningful.
Perfect. Stephen, same question.
The strategy that really resonated with me in the book is this concept of being interruptible. And I was the one who came up with this story, and I had this memory of college, and I had this professor named Dr. Husband, and he was my favorite professor out of the University of Illinois. This guy's amazing. And I had him my junior year. In my senior year, he was no longer a professor. It wasn't during office hours, but I just wanted to pop in and say hi. So I peeked my head around his office. He saw me. He closed his laptop. He turned right towards the door. He stood up and he said, "Stephen, my friend, come on in." And he ushered me in with this big old smile on his face. And I remember in that moment, like 20 plus years ago, of how important he made me feel. Because he was busy, he was doing something, and he, we call it the swivel effect. Like he just turned right to me and gave me his undivided attention. And for me now, I'm really, really mindful of how interruptible I am. And we're really busy. There's lots going on, and I could turn off all my devices and I could lock my door. I work from home, like many others, but I've been more tuned into the needs of the people around me. And I've allowed myself to waver from a bit of productivity in order to foster some of the connection points that are interrupting my day. And from a mental health standpoint, it's wonderful because I feel connected and I'm taking more time to do the work that needs to be done, so I don't have any mental health struggles.
Guys, thank you both for being here. I've got thoughts that I want to comment on about what they just said, but I'm going to save that for the next session when Chuck and I are going to come together. And so stay for that. It wasn't on the schedule, but that's what's coming up next here in just a sec. We went a little long here, guys. I hope you didn't mind. I'm guessing that our audience didn't mind. No one's leaving. So Steve and Ryan, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you. And thank you for the great book. You see all the links over there to the book and the assessments and the app and all that stuff. Thanks to you both for being here.
We appreciate you. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks for having us, Kevin.